Hello everyone and welcome back to the video. Today we're going to be talking about one of the most controversial topics in Age of Empires 2 at the moment, and that is the Franks and whether or not they are overpowered. Now, for a lot of people, this might just be an easy yes, and the Franks, based on your own experience or based on the stats that you guys might have seen, it's a civilization that is just clearly overtuned and something has to change for it to be more fair and more balanced. And the stats would actually support this. Now, I initially thought that the Franks are just a low elo phenomenon and they dominate the lower elo brackets, but at higher elos, players tend to know how to deal with them and their win rate will drop off. However, after doing some research, which I always do for these kind of videos, because I like to use my opinion, but I don't like to base my opinion over fact. At the end of the day, fact is king, and the fact states that Franks have a 54.5% win rate at 2000 elo and above on 1v1 Arabia, which is absolutely absurd, and that places them at a top 5 civilizations for this particular game situation. Also, throughout all elos, Franks have between a 54.5% win rate and a 56.5% win rate based on the elo bracket, which is a pretty negligible difference or margin, and so we can clearly average out that the Franks have a 55% win rate overall for 1v1 Arabia rank ladder. Now, based on the stats alone, this is almost impossible to argue against. It's very clear to anyone who understands basic statistics that a civilization with that high of a win rate and sitting at the top 5 highest win rate civilization is clearly overpowered. Also, to further this point, the civilizations above the Franks in most cases are the Gurjaras and the Hindustani, which are new civilizations that came with a recent patch / DLC, and clearly those civilizations have some stuff that is overtuned and overpowered. So if Franks are only being passed by some of the clearly overpowered civs, this only supports the claim that they are also themselves overpowered. However, it's not that simple, and before we hop into the weaknesses that the Franks have, I want to further talk about a couple more of the strengths that they have and why I think they're reaching such a high win rate. At the end of the video, I hope to make a final statement and a conclusion as to whether or not I think they are overpowered, and I want you guys to also hear my points out and let me know in the comments below what you guys think overall as the Franks and whether or not they need to see a nerf or just kind of educate players on how to deal with them a bit more. Let's hop into some of the pros and cons. So like I said, let's talk a little bit more about their pros as a civilization and kind of divert a little bit more away from the stats. So why are they reaching such a high win rate? Well, my theory / opinion from seeing some of the games that are played using the Franks, also some of my personal games as well may play a role in here, is that they're very simple to understand and they have a very basic yet strong game plan. So this helps both the average player and the casual player and the new player in picking up a civilization that is going to be extremely easy to execute on compared to some of the other civilizations that are a bit more complicated, a bit more timing oriented. Franks is pretty much smooth as butter throughout the entire game, gives you bonuses in the early game, in the mid game, and it has a really easy game plan in the late game, which is just to overrun your opponent with cavalry, particularly the paladin. So combining a simple game plan with a fun civ to play for lower levels seems to be the best kind of recipe for a strong civilization. As we near towards like the mid elo and higher elo, in my opinion, Franks tend to get more flexible and people realize just how diverse they are in the early game in those higher levels, and we start to see that they just have an insane early game economy, and we can use that early game economy to put the first punch on your opponent, get the initial pressure right off the bat, set the tempo for the game, and then use that tempo to get a faster castage time, and then either proceed to go for a nice boom and pick up some relics, or to push with a siege workshop. So a lot of the options start to come into play, and it goes from being just an easy, knight into paladin civilization at lower levels to now a very flexible, very aggressive civilization for those mid levels. As we go over to the higher elos and start to touch into some pro play, although some of the weaknesses start to come out, they are still a very strong civilization, and I think that a lot of the timing advantages that you get off the Franks with like the mid game, the faster castage time, start to be really abused by the higher level players, and some of the weaknesses that might show, like camels countering knights, are covered because a lot of Frank players in higher elo just open archers and use their economy bonuses or their timing bonuses to secure relics and develop their economy at home, thus just putting themselves further ahead into the game without exposing themselves to such blatant weaknesses like camels countering knights. So overall, Franks just have a really good kit across a bunch of different elo ranges, and really wherever you are as an intermediate or a casual player or a pro player or an expert player, you're gonna be able to find a way to use the Franks in a great way and be able to gain clear advantages over your opponent in a consistent fashion, because like I said, at the end of the day, they're a very simple and consistent civilization. Now, another reason that the Franks are such a strong civilization across a bunch of different ELO ranges, and I keep mentioning this because I really want to hammer home the idea that they're really solid across everyone who puts their hands on them, and it's not a specific lower ELO or higher ELO thing. So one more reason that the Franks are good across a bunch of different ELO ranges is the fact that all their bonuses are accessible. Let's recap. They get the berry bonus, which lets them get extra food in the early game, which happens almost every game on One Foot in Arabia. Hardly see you getting denied berries from Dark Age. Then you get the extra HP on Scouts and Knights and all the way up to Paladin, which is something that could be used at all stages. It is even used on your initial Scouts. You're always getting some sort of value off that. Then you're going to go ahead and get the farm upgrades for free, which saves you resources and lets you develop your economy in a great fashion while letting you save those resources and use them on the aggressive or to just simply get a faster castle each time, which is just a huge bonus and a really flexible one and one that just comes for free. So right away in the first 3 bonuses, there's something in there every single game that you get benefit off of. And the last bonus, although it's not as free as the first 3, it's the cheaper castles, which isn't something that comes into play that early, but it comes into play almost every game. You're gonna need castles to secure map control. It opens up cheaper options to go forward castle and it being affordable. You can go for a lot of defensive castles and even just have more castles because they're cheaper. And so this bonus comes into play more often than not as well, and is also quite a flexible bonus and an accessible bonus. So right away, without even diving into their tech tree or without even diving into some of their unique bonuses or unique units, we can see that the 4 bonuses they have are easily accessible in every single game of 1v1 Arabia. Not to mention that the forward castles, especially in lower levels, let's be honest guys, it's a great way to end the game and something that the Franks do arguably the best out of all the civilization, to just get map control in early castle and drop a forward castle that in this case is cheaper. So now that we've taken a look at some of the strengths that the Franks have as a civilization, let's take a look at some of their weaknesses to see whether or not they're actually overpowered, or we just have to alter the way we play against them, or we view the civ as a whole. Alright, so the first weakness that the Franks have is the fact that they have some clear gaps in their civilization, and the main thing being their limited tech tree. Now, the Franks aren't as predictable as a lot of people may make them seem. They are not just an all-in knight or scout into knight start to finish all the way up to paladin civilization that you might initially think they are. They actually have a lot of different options, as I mentioned earlier on in this video, when it comes to just like the timings that they can do in the feudal age, like open some scouts and switch to crossbow in castle age, develop their economy, get their relics, and play from there. They can also go for like some extended feudal ages, like going for men at arms, then following up to archers, and then going for scouts because you get extra value without having bloodlines. So they have a lot of different options that they can go for. However, they do have some weaknesses, and these weaknesses are mainly found in their trash unit and in some of the options they have going into the late game. So when I talk about trash unit, let's take a look at their options. They have 72 HP light cav with full upgrades, minus obviously the bloodlines, which are not that impressive, although not bad. They have halberdier that are fully upgraded, which is pretty solid. But then the big weakness here, the skirmisher. You're lacking bracer and you're lacking the last armor upgrade for the skirmisher, pretty much rendering them completely useless against a lot of the strong archer civs. That's a major red flag when it comes to the Frank late game. Also comes to the Frank flexibility going into the late game. Also, you don't really have a good option when it comes to siege, so creating that one big death ball, although the siege is decently flexible with bomber cannon, you don't have that choice to go for like a big death ball with siege onagers or siege ram. So pushing for the kill really early through siege isn't really on the cards for a lot of your Frank games. So you're basically funneled into playing one of two options in the late game. You can either play hand cannon and bomber cannon to try to push with, say, an anti-infantry composition, or you can play with your two best option late game, which is cavalry and infantry. You do get fully upgraded halberdier and champions. However, those are pretty much situational units, and halberdiers are mainly used to counter camels or other cavalry civs, and your champions are basically used to counter trash units in general. You also have the paladin, which is your go-to, and that's something that you obviously want to go for, but oftentimes you're going to run into a lot of counters like camels and halberdier, so you have to be very careful. They have the throwing axeman available, but my biggest issue with the throwing axeman is that it actually doesn't solve the weaknesses that Franks suffer from. Yes, it counters infantry, but so does the hand cannon, and they both have the same weakness, unfortunately, which is long range archers or siege that does mass damage to small groups of units. Generally speaking, the throwing axeman is more tanky, but also has less range than the hand cannon. So in my opinion, I class them in the same area where they're good if they're countering what they're supposed to counter, which is just like halberdier in general, and throwing axeman is good against trash in general or infantry in general. But unfortunately, they both die to the same thing, and that is once again what Franks in general seems to struggle with, which is just just a combination of Arbalest and Halberdier. Arbalest to counter throwing axeman or hand cannoneer, and then Halberdier to cover all the cavalry options. This is a prime composition for a lot of the civilizations going into late game, and it's something that the Franks struggle with. I can't think of a single unit that the Franks can make to efficiently counter this composition without sinking a ton of gold into making that unit, and the options are Paladin, Onager, or Bomber Cannon. Onager has clear weaknesses because it dies to Bomber Cannon, and Bomber Cannon is a very expensive unit that doesn't really do mass damage to these infantry, and it's pretty easily picked off by either Bomber Cannons of their own, or if they play monks with extra range, that can help as well, or even some light cav as well. So as you can see, when facing this prime composition of Arbalest and Halberdier, Franks run out of options rather quickly when thinking of their late game composition, and that, in my opinion, that is my first big weakness when it comes to the Franks. The next big weakness is the fact that their late game is extremely gold reliant. And now I'm not talking about something that is like, oh, they have a 1 power unit, but they can keep it alive forever, like the Magyar Cav Archer or like the Mangudai. No, their gold unit, or their primary gold unit, is going to be the Paladin. That is the best Frank late game unit in general. And the problem with having your gold unit as the melee unit is that it always has to be in the front line fighting, and that puts it the most at risk. It's also the unit that your opponent will try to counter the hardest, and so generally speaking, in a proper late game, you're going to be losing a lot of your gold units, and if you don't have the gold or the relics to sustain this production long term, you're going to run into some serious issues when it comes to trying to keep your composition going and play into that really late game. And so once the Franks run out of gold, they're once again sucked back into those weak trash options that we just earlier covered, and they don't really have a game plan. You can't win a game by playing with suboptimal skirms and some odd light cav that have less HP than a generic fully upgraded light cav. And so if you run out of gold with the Franks in late game, generally speaking, you're gonna probably lose that game. And that, in my opinion, is a very big weakness, especially once you understand how to abuse that efficiently. The last weakness I'm going to talk about when it comes to the Frank is the fact that they have some strong counters because of these weaknesses. This is especially important when it comes to a draft and a tournament. If you just initially pick Franks as your first pick and it's obvious you're using them for Arabia, your opponent can pick a clear counter civ that can easily nullify all of the Frank's strengths and just double down on their weaknesses, which makes them extremely susceptible, especially in that tournament play. This isn't exactly the case for rank ladder because you can't see what your opponent is going to be picking and you have really no idea what they're going to be picking. But what I will say is that some of the civilizations, or a fair bit of civilizations in the pool, have specific options that they can use to counter the Franks, and once again, a lot of those options come into play in early or late Imperial Age. Now, if you've noticed, and in all fairness to the Franks in this particular case, a lot of the weaknesses that they encounter come into play only starting in Imperial Age. Now, this is a double-edged sword because on one hand, most games end before Imperial Age, and we all know this. So if they end beforehand, the Franks have a major advantage and they get a lot of bonuses to enable them to end the game in Imperial Age. But a second big thing, or like on the other hand, that you have to consider is if we know as players that Franks have a ton of weaknesses in the late game, such as their gold reliance and their weaknesses in the tech tree, as I mentioned, we can just make our entire strategy to abuse those weaknesses and stop thinking that we have to win in the early game to deal with the Franks. And this brings me to my main argument when it comes to the weaknesses around the Franks. A lot of people just try to play head on and are frustrated when they get completely overwhelmed with the Franks, who do the same thing they're trying to do in the early game, but better because they have simply more bonuses geared towards that part of the game. However, my opinion is you need to start thinking about their weaknesses, which all come into play in the late game, and base your strategy completely around that by A, playing defensive in the early game and mid game, or B, getting the first punch in to nullify the Frank early game and using specific civs to do this, and then simply using that initial advantage to pick up relics and secure the map control, and then just defend until Imperial Age. Both of these tactics work, either giving control and trying to defend and keep your economy healthy, or gaining control of the map early if you have a fast-paced civ, and then just simply taking the relics and then giving it back up in the mid game to then secure a strong late game. So with all this in mind, it's time to make some concluding statements and really just try to understand whether or not Franks are overpowered. Now, from my perspective, I see them as a really good civ to play as the first game in a tournament when both players are not quite warmed up and you just need a simple and easy to execute strategy. I think the Franks are great in that position because there's really not much that can go wrong, and it's all about just playing a safe and standard game one to get you warmed up into the series, and there's not going to be any nerves that get in the way of you making a timing timing push and potentially losing the game if you miss the timing by a little bit. In lower levels and moving away from tournament play, I think that it's going to be very easy for you to abuse the Frank's strengths because unfortunately players are not going to be smart enough to just wait it out until Imperial Age and only try to find a win at that point. Overall, what I would say is the Franks are not overpowered, because my definition of overpowered is when there's literally nothing I can do and I have played perfectly and I can't win. That is my definition of overpowered, and unfortunately, or rather fortunately, there's not a lot of civilizations in Age of Empires 2 that fall under that category, and Franks certainly do not fall under that category. I can see that they have clear weaknesses against Halberdier and Arbalest compositions, and there's a lot of civilizations in the game that can get to that composition in a reasonable time against the Franks. And yes, it might be difficult to survive the early and mid game against the Franks in some cases. I think that with good play and smart thinking and some tactical decisions here and there, I think it's definitely possible and definitely doable in most cases, if not in all cases. So my overall answer is that Franks are not overpowered. I just think that they're extremely hard to play against, and even for the lower levels, I think that if players just played a little bit smarter, they'd have a better time against the Franks and they'd be able to bring that win rate down slightly without seeing any nerfs to the civilization. Don't get me wrong though, it's still an incredibly strong civilization and it's still one of my favorites to play, and I even pick it in a lot of tournaments as well. So that's going to be it for me, guys. Let me know what you guys thought about the video in general and whether or not you guys think that the Franks are overpowered or they're perfectly fine. We just have to adapt the way we think or play against the civilization. Also, do let me know if I missed anything as far as this particular topic goes, and if you have anything to add, let me know in the comments below and I'd love to read them. Thanks for watching, and I'll catch you guys in the next one. Peace.